The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Braxton's training grounds as Sarah Martinez adjusted her military uniform for what felt like the 100th time. The fabric pulled slightly against her left shoulder, a constant reminder of something she preferred to keep buried in the depths of her memory. She had been stationed at this base for 3 months now, and today marked another mandatory physical training session that she dreaded more than facing enemy fire. Colonel James Harrison stood at the center of the formation, his imposing figure cutting through the early morning mist like a statue carved from granite. His reputation preceded him wherever he went, a decorated officer with 30 years of service, known for his unwavering discipline and zero tolerance for what he considered weakness. His steel-gray eyes swept across the assembled soldiers with the precision of a hawk scanning for prey. Sarah positioned herself toward the back of the formation, hoping to blend into the crowd of uniformed bodies. She had learned early in her military career that sometimes survival meant knowing when to be invisible. Her fellow soldiers chatted quietly among themselves, discussing weekend plans and sharing complaints about the upcoming exercises. She remained silent, her mind already calculating how she would navigate the challenges ahead. The PT instructor, Sergeant Williams, began outlining the day's activities. Push-ups, sit-ups, a 2-mile run, and combat obstacle course training. Sarah's heart sank with each announced exercise. She had completed her medical clearance paperwork weeks ago, carefully noting her limitations without providing too much detail. The base medical officer had signed off on modified duties, but she knew that wouldn't stop the questions or the scrutiny. As the formation began to disperse toward the first exercise station, Sarah approached Sergeant Williams with her medical documentation. The sergeant glanced at the papers, his expression neutral but professional. He had seen plenty of soldiers with various injuries and limitations throughout his career, and he knew better than to make assumptions. Modified push-ups and alternative exercises for the upper body work, he said quietly, handing back her papers. Report to Station 3 for your alternatives. Sarah nodded gratefully and headed toward the designated area. She had hoped to complete her modified routine without drawing attention, but fate had other plans. As she began her modified exercises, she noticed Colonel Harrison's gaze fixed on her from across the training ground. His expression was unreadable, but she could sense his disapproval radiating across the distance between them. The modified exercises felt awkward under the weight of his stare. While her fellow soldiers performed standard push-ups, Sarah worked through a series of alternative movements designed to accommodate her physical limitations. Each repetition felt scrutinized, judged, and found wanting. She could almost hear the colonel's thoughts, another soldier trying to take the easy way out, another excuse to avoid the real work of military service. After completing her alternative exercises, Sarah moved to the cardio station where she could participate more fully. Running had always been her strength, even with her limitations. As she settled into a steady pace around the track, she felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. This was where she could prove herself, where her injury didn't define her capabilities. But, even as she ran, she could feel Colonel Harrison's presence like a shadow following her progress. He had moved to a position where he could observe multiple training stations, but his attention kept returning to her. She had encountered officers like him before, those who saw any deviation from standard protocol as a sign of weakness or lack of commitment. The whispers started during the water break. Sarah pretended not to hear them, but the words carried across the training ground like smoke. Special treatment, someone muttered. Probably faking it, another voice added. She had heard it all before, in different places and different circumstances, but it never stopped stinging. Corporal Janet Stevens, one of the few soldiers Sarah had begun to consider a friend, approached during the break. Janet had noticed the tension and the whispers, and her protective instincts had kicked in. She had served with enough soldiers to recognize when someone was carrying more than just physical weight. "Don't let them get to you," Janet said quietly, offering Sarah a bottle of water. "Half these guys couldn't handle a paper cut without calling for a medic." Sarah managed a weak smile, grateful for the support but knowing it wouldn't change the fundamental problem. As long as she required modifications to standard training, she would face questions and skepticism. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had faced real combat, real danger, and real consequences, yet here she was being judged for not performing standard push-ups. The final exercise of the morning was the obstacle course, a series of challenges designed to test agility, strength, and problem-solving under pressure. Sarah had been dreading this moment since she woke up. The course included rope climbing, wall scaling, and crawling through confined spaces, all activities that would severely test her physical limitations. As she approached the starting line with her group, Colonel Harrison positioned himself directly beside the course. His presence was no longer subtle, he was making a statement. Sarah could feel the weight of his expectation and judgment pressing down on her like a physical force. "Martinez," Sergeant Williams called out, consulting his clipboard. "You're cleared for modified participation. Skip the rope climb and wall scaling, proceed directly to the crawling section." The announcement rang out across the training area, and Sarah felt every eye turn toward her. The whispers grew louder, less discreet. Some soldiers shook their heads in apparent disgust, while others simply stared with curiosity. She had become a spectacle, the soldier who couldn't meet the standard. Colonel Harrison stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of decades in command. "Sergeant Williams, what exactly are Specialist Martinez's limitations? I've been observing her performance this morning, and I'm concerned about the extent of these accommodations." Sarah felt her blood turn cold. This was the moment she had been dreading since arriving at Fort Braxton. The moment when her carefully maintained privacy would be challenged by someone with the authority to demand answers. She could see the other soldiers gathering around, sensing drama and conflict. "Sir, Specialist Martinez has proper medical documentation for modified PT duties," Sergeant Williams replied, his tone professional but slightly defensive. He respected the colonel's authority but also understood the importance of protecting soldiers' medical privacy. "I'm aware of the documentation, Sergeant," Colonel Harrison replied, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "What I'm questioning is whether these accommodations are necessary or if we're enabling avoidance of challenging training." The accusation hung in the air like a live grenade. Sarah felt the familiar surge of anger and frustration that she had learned to suppress over the years. She wanted to lash out, to defend herself, to reveal the truth that would silence the doubts and whispers. But she also knew that some truths were too painful to share, too personal to use as weapons in petty conflicts. "Sir, with respect," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her, "my medical limitations are documented and approved by the base medical officer. I follow all protocols and complete all required training within my approved parameters." Colonel Harrison's expression didn't change, but Sarah could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. He was a man accustomed to absolute compliance and traditional military standards. In his experience, soldiers who couldn't meet the basic physical requirements were either injured, weak, or looking for an easy way out. He had no patience for any of those categories. "That may be true, Specialist," he said, his tone measured but skeptical, "but I've served in this military for 30 years. I've seen soldiers overcome incredible obstacles through determination and proper training. I've also seen soldiers use minor injuries as excuses to avoid the hard work that military service requires." The implication was clear, and Sarah felt it like a slap across the face. Around her, the other soldiers watched the confrontation with a mixture of fascination and discomfort. Some nodded in agreement with the colonel's words, while others seemed uncomfortable with the public nature of the challenge. Janet Stevens stepped slightly closer to Sarah, a subtle show of support that didn't go unnoticed. Sergeant Williams shifted uncomfortably, caught between respecting his superior officer and protecting his soldiers' privacy and dignity. Sarah took a deep breath, weighing her options carefully. She could continue to deflect and avoid, maintaining her privacy at the cost of her reputation and standing. She could request a private meeting with the colonel to discuss her limitations in detail. Or she could make a stand here, in front of everyone, and hope that the truth would be enough to end the speculation and doubt. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting shorter shadows across the training ground. The other exercise stations had gone quiet as word of the confrontation spread. What had begun as routine physical training had transformed into a moment of reckoning that would define Sarah's future at Fort Braxton. Colonel Harrison waited for her response, his posture radiating the confidence of a man who believed he held the moral high ground. He had seen too many soldiers try to game the system, too many attempts to avoid the difficult aspects of military service. In his mind, he was protecting the integrity of the institution he had devoted his life to serving. Sarah looked around at the faces surrounding her, some supportive, some skeptical, some simply curious about how this drama would unfold. She thought about all the times she had faced similar challenges, all the moments when she had been forced to prove herself again and again. The weight of her hidden truth pressed against her chest like a physical burden. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken tensions and competing narratives. Sarah knew that whatever happened next would set the tone for her remaining time at this base. She could continue to hide behind medical documentation and privacy protections, or she could take the risk of revealing a truth that might change everything. As she prepared to make her choice, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in the window of a nearby building. The woman looking back at her wore the same uniform as everyone else, carried the same rank, and had sworn the same oath of service. But, hidden beneath that uniform was a story that would challenge every assumption Colonel Harrison had made about her character and commitment. The moment hung suspended between them like a taut wire, ready to snap with the slightest pressure. Sarah felt the familiar weight of her secret pressing against her shoulder, a constant reminder of a day when everything changed. She had carried this burden alone for so long that it had become part of her identity, woven into the fabric of who she was as a soldier and as a person. Colonel Harrison's expectant stare demanded an answer, a justification, or an admission. The assembled soldiers waited for resolution to a confrontation that had escalated beyond simple questions about physical training. What none of them knew was that Sarah's response would reveal truths that would force everyone present to reconsider their assumptions about strength, sacrifice, and the true cost of military service. Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her left shoulder, a gesture so subtle that only those watching closely would notice. The fabric of her uniform shifted slightly under her fingers, concealing what lay beneath. She had made her decision in that moment of silence, understanding that some battles could only be won through uncomfortable truths. "Colonel Harrison," she began, her voice carrying across the now silent training ground. "You mentioned that you've served for 30 years and seen soldiers overcome incredible obstacles. You're right about that. Some obstacles require different approaches than others." The colonel's expression remained stern, but something in Sarah's tone gave him pause. There was a gravity to her words that suggested this conversation was about to take an unexpected turn. The assembled soldiers sensed the shift in atmosphere, their casual interest transforming into focused attention. "I've been in the military for 8 years, Sarah continued, her gaze fixed directly on Colonel Harrison's face. "I've served 2 combat deployments, received commendations for service under fire, and have never failed to complete a mission. My physical training modifications aren't about avoiding hard work or taking shortcuts." Sergeant Williams watched the exchange with growing concern. He could sense that Sarah was preparing to cross a line she had carefully maintained since arriving at the base. While he respected her right to privacy, he also recognized the signs of a soldier who had been pushed too far. Colonel Harrison's posture shifted slightly, his military instincts picking up on the change in Sarah's demeanor. After 3 decades of commanding soldiers, he had developed an ability to read people that went beyond surface appearances. Something in Sarah's bearing suggested that his initial assessment might have been premature. "Then, explain to me, Specialist Martinez," he said, his tone still challenging but with a note of genuine curiosity creeping in. "Help me understand why a decorated soldier with combat experience requires modifications for basic physical training exercises." Sarah looked around at the faces surrounding her, fellow soldiers who had been whispering and speculating about her limitations. She saw Janet Stevens offering an encouraging nod, Sergeant Williams looking concerned but supportive, and various other expressions ranging from skeptical to sympathetic. The decision she was about to make would expose her most carefully guarded vulnerability. "Sir, my limitations stem from injuries sustained during my 2nd deployment," she began, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of what she was about to reveal. "I was wounded in action while conducting a patrol mission outside Kandahar." The training ground fell completely silent. Even the distant sounds of other military activities seemed to fade into the background as everyone present focused on Sarah's words. Colonel Harrison's expression began to shift from skeptical authority to something approaching attention and respect. Sarah took a deep breath before continuing. Our convoy was hit by an improvised explosive device while we were returning from a village outreach mission. The blast threw me from the vehicle and caused severe trauma to my left shoulder, back, and ribcage. I also sustained a traumatic brain injury that affected my balance and coordination for several months. The revelation hit the assembled soldiers like a physical blow. Those who had been whispering about special treatment and fake injuries suddenly found themselves confronting the reality of a wounded warrior standing among them. The casual assumptions and quick judgments that had characterized the morning's events evaporated in the face of Sarah's matter-of-fact description of her combat injuries. Colonel Harrison's entire demeanor changed as the implications of Sarah's words sank in. His 30 years of service had included multiple deployments and interactions with countless wounded warriors. He understood intimately the physical and psychological toll that combat injuries could exact on even the strongest soldiers. "Specialist Martinez," he said, his voice now carrying a note of respect that had been absent moments before. "I apologize for questioning your integrity without understanding the full circumstances. Combat injuries are a different matter entirely." But Sarah wasn't finished. The decision to reveal her truth had opened a floodgate of memories and emotions that she had kept carefully contained for years. Having started down this path, she felt compelled to tell the complete story rather than leaving it as a simple statement of injury. "The explosion killed 2 members of our team instantly," she continued, her voice beginning to carry the weight of survivor's guilt that she had carried for years. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez and Corporal Thompson. They were good soldiers, good people with families waiting for them at home." Janet Stevens felt tears forming in her eyes as she listened to Sarah's account. She had suspected that her friend carried some kind of burden, but she had never imagined the depth of trauma that lay beneath Sarah's quiet exterior. Around the training ground, other soldiers were having similar realizations about their own assumptions and judgments. "I was unconscious for 3 days," Sarah went on, her narrative taking on the quality of testimony that demanded respectful attention. "When I woke up in the field hospital, the doctors told me that I was lucky to be alive. The shrapnel had missed major arteries and organs, but the damage to my shoulder and back was extensive." Colonel Harrison listened with the focused attention of a commander receiving a mission briefing. His earlier skepticism had been completely replaced by professional respect and personal concern for the soldier standing before him. He began to understand that his challenge to her physical limitations wasn't just inappropriate, it was potentially re-traumatizing. "The medical team did everything they could," Sarah continued, "but some injuries don't heal completely. The shrapnel fragments that they couldn't safely remove are still there, embedded in my shoulder and back muscles. They shift and cause pain during certain movements, particularly those that require extending my arms above my head or supporting my full body weight on my upper extremities." Sergeant Williams nodded with understanding, having worked with other wounded warriors who faced similar challenges. He realized now why Sarah's medical documentation had been so carefully worded and why she had been so reluctant to discuss the details of her limitations. The physical description of her injuries was difficult enough, but Sarah knew that the complete truth included psychological dimensions that were even harder to articulate. The decision to reveal her combat wounds had started a process that she felt compelled to complete, regardless of the personal cost. "The traumatic brain injury affected my balance and spatial awareness for months," she explained. "I had to relearn basic coordination skills and develop new strategies for maintaining stability during physical activities. The obstacle course elements that I skip aren't about laziness or fear, they're about preventing me from falling and potentially causing additional injury to myself or others." The training ground remained absolutely quiet as Sarah's words painted a picture of resilience and adaptation that none of the assembled soldiers had expected. Her explanation transformed their understanding of what they had witnessed that morning from a story about avoiding difficult training to one about a wounded warrior finding ways to continue serving despite significant limitations. Colonel Harrison struggled with his own emotions as he listened to Sarah's account. His 3 decades of service had taught him to value strength, determination, and adherence to standards. But they had also taught him to recognize genuine sacrifice and dedication when he encountered them. Sarah's story challenged his initial assumptions in ways that made him question his own judgment. "Specialist Martinez," he said quietly, "your service and sacrifice are recognized and appreciated. I was wrong to question your commitment or integrity without understanding the circumstances behind your limitations. But Sarah could see that her revelation had opened questions beyond just her physical training modifications. She could sense the curiosity and sympathy from her fellow soldiers, but also the uncomfortable realization that she was fundamentally different from most of them. She had crossed a line from colleague to wounded veteran, and that transformation carried its own complications. The hardest part, she said, her voice beginning to show the strain of reliving traumatic memories, wasn't the physical pain or the long rehabilitation process. It was accepting that I would never again be the soldier I was before that day. I had to redefine what strength meant and find new ways to contribute to the mission. Janet Stevens wiped away tears that she no longer tried to hide. She realized that every conversation she had shared with Sarah, every moment of casual interaction, had been shaped by experiences that she could barely imagine. The casual complaints about training and duty that characterized most soldiers' conversations suddenly seemed trivial in comparison. Colonel Harrison found himself facing a profound shift in perspective. His challenge to Sarah's physical limitations had been based on decades of experience with soldiers who sought to avoid difficult training. But Sarah's revelation forced him to confront the reality that not all limitations were created equal, and that true dedication sometimes required working within constraints rather than overcoming them through sheer determination. I spent 8 months in rehabilitation, Sarah continued, her narrative now flowing with the cathartic release of long-suppressed truth. Physical therapy, occupational therapy, psychological counseling, everything designed to help me adapt to my new reality while maintaining my military career. The detail about psychological counseling resonated with several soldiers in the formation who had their own experiences with post-traumatic stress and combat-related mental health challenges. Sarah's willingness to acknowledge that dimension of her recovery added another layer of authenticity to her account. My medical team and I worked together to develop training modifications that would allow me to maintain my fitness and military readiness while protecting my injured areas from further damage, she explained. Every exercise alternative in my documentation represents hours of consultation with specialists who understand both military requirements and combat injury rehabilitation. Sergeant Williams nodded with new appreciation for the complexity of Sarah's situation. He realized that the modified exercises he had assigned weren't arbitrary accommodations but carefully designed alternatives that served both medical and military purposes. Colonel Harrison was beginning to understand that his morning confrontation with Sarah had revealed his own limitations as much as it had exposed her truth. His experience and authority had led him to make assumptions that were not only wrong but potentially harmful to a soldier who had already sacrificed more for her country than most people could imagine. The longer Sarah spoke, the more the assembled soldiers began to reassess their own assumptions about strength, service, and sacrifice. Her physical limitations, which had seemed like weaknesses or excuses just minutes earlier, now appeared as evidence of incredible resilience and determination. I never wanted special treatment, Sarah said, her voice carrying a note of vulnerability that made her seem more human and relatable than the distant figure she had appeared to be during her months at Fort Braxton. I just wanted to continue serving in whatever capacity my injuries would allow. The admission struck at the heart of every soldier's deepest fear, that injury or limitation might end their ability to serve alongside their comrades. Sarah's story wasn't just about physical wounds, it was about the psychological challenge of redefining identity and purpose after trauma. Colonel Harrison realized that his response to Sarah's revelation would be observed and remembered by every soldier present. His next words would either validate the courage she had shown in revealing her truth or compound the harm of his initial assumptions. The weight of leadership had never felt heavier than it did in that moment. Colonel Harrison stood motionless for several long seconds, the weight of Sarah's revelation settling over the training ground like morning fog. His weathered face, which moments earlier had displayed skepticism and authority, now showed the complex emotions of a career military officer confronting his own misjudgment. The silence stretched uncomfortably as everyone present waited to see how their commanding officer would respond to this unexpected turn of events. Specialist Martinez, he finally said, his voice noticeably softer than the commanding tone he had used throughout the morning. Would you be willing to speak with me privately after the training session concludes? I believe I owe you more than just an apology. Sarah nodded, unsure what to expect from a private conversation but recognizing that the colonel's request represented a significant shift from his earlier confrontational approach. Around them, the other soldiers began to disperse slowly, their whispered conversations now carrying tones of respect and curiosity rather than skepticism and judgment. Sergeant Williams approached Sarah as the formation broke up, his expression mixing professional concern with personal admiration. He had supervised thousands of training sessions throughout his career, but he had never witnessed such a dramatic transformation in both participants and observers. Sarah's courage in revealing her combat injuries had fundamentally changed the dynamics of the entire unit. "Martinez," he said quietly, "you didn't have to share all of that with everyone. I know how difficult it must have been to relive those experiences." Sarah managed a weak smile, still processing the emotions that her revelation had stirred up. "Maybe it was time," she replied. "I've been carrying this alone for so long that I forgot what it felt like to have people understand rather than judge." Janet Stevens waited nearby, her eyes still showing traces of tears from Sarah's powerful account. As Sarah's closest friend at Fort Braxton, she felt a mixture of admiration for her courage and regret for not recognizing the depth of trauma that Sarah had been managing alone. Their casual conversations and shared meals suddenly seemed inadequate in light of what she now understood about her friend's experiences. The remainder of the morning training session proceeded with a subdued but respectful atmosphere. Word of Sarah's revelation spread quickly through informal channels, and soldiers who had not been present during the confrontation began to learn about the decorated combat veteran in their midst. The casual assumptions and quick judgments that had characterized earlier interactions with Sarah were replaced by a more thoughtful and respectful approach. As the official training concluded, Colonel Harrison waited near the administrative building for his private conversation with Sarah. He had spent the intervening time reflecting on his own leadership style and the assumptions that had guided his initial response to her physical limitations. His 30 years of military experience had taught him many lessons, but this morning had provided education of a different kind entirely. Sarah approached the meeting with mixed emotions. She had revealed more about herself in one morning than she had shared during her entire time at Fort Braxton, and the vulnerability she felt was both liberating and terrifying. The colonel's request for a private conversation could lead to understanding and resolution, or it could result in unwanted attention and complications that she had been trying to avoid. "Specialist Martinez," Colonel Harrison began as they entered his office, "I want to start by offering you a sincere and unreserved apology. My assumptions about your character and commitment were not only wrong but deeply unfair to a soldier who has sacrificed more for this country than I had any right to question." The formal nature of his apology carried weight that casual words could not have conveyed. Sarah could see that the colonel was genuinely struggling with his own reaction to the morning's events, and his willingness to admit error spoke to a character that valued truth over pride. "Sir, I appreciate your apology," Sarah replied, "but I also understand why you question my limitations. Without context, my training modifications probably did look like someone trying to avoid challenging work." Colonel Harrison shook his head firmly. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that led to this morning's problems. I allowed my preconceptions about physical fitness standards to override my responsibility to understand the individual circumstances of the soldiers under my command." The conversation that followed was unlike any interaction Sarah had experienced with a senior officer. Colonel Harrison asked detailed questions about her injuries, her rehabilitation process, and her ongoing challenges, but his inquiries came from a place of genuine interest in understanding rather than skeptical interrogation. His questions revealed a sophisticated understanding of combat injuries and their long-term effects that surprised Sarah. "I've worked with many wounded warriors throughout my career," he explained, "but I've also encountered soldiers who attempted to manipulate the system for personal advantage. The challenge for commanders is distinguishing between legitimate needs and attempts at exploitation without being unfair to either group." Sarah nodded with understanding. "I've seen both types of soldiers too, sir. That's part of why I've been reluctant to discuss my situation openly. I didn't want to be seen as someone making excuses or seeking sympathy." The colonel leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "That reluctance probably made my assumptions even easier to make. Without knowing your background, I only saw the surface indicators that could suggest either legitimate need or manipulation. Their conversation revealed the complexity of managing military units that included soldiers with varying capabilities and limitations. Colonel Harrison began to understand that effective leadership sometimes required moving beyond traditional standards to accommodate individual circumstances without compromising overall unit effectiveness. "Tell me about your current role and responsibilities," he said. "How are you contributing to the mission despite your physical limitations?" Sarah's response revealed the depth of her continued commitment to military service. Despite her injuries, she had found ways to excel in areas that didn't require the full range of physical capabilities. Her work in intelligence analysis, training coordination, and mentorship of newer soldiers demonstrated that her value to the unit extended far beyond her performance on physical training exercises. "I've been working on developing new training protocols for soldiers with combat-related injuries," she explained. "My experience with rehabilitation and adaptation has given me insights that could help other wounded warriors continue their military careers." Colonel Harrison's interest was immediately piqued. The military's growing population of wounded warriors represented both a challenge and an opportunity for commanders who understood how to effectively utilize their skills and experience. Sarah's combination of combat experience and personal understanding of injury rehabilitation made her uniquely qualified to address this emerging need. "That's exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need," he said. "Have you documented any of your ideas or developed formal proposals for new protocols?" The conversation shifted from apology and explanation to collaboration and planning. Sarah found herself discussing possibilities she had only considered privately, sharing ideas that her isolation and secrecy had prevented her from pursuing openly. Colonel Harrison's receptiveness and enthusiasm encouraged her to think more ambitiously about her potential contributions. "I'd like you to prepare a comprehensive proposal for a wounded warrior support program," he said. "Include training modifications, peer support networks, and career development pathways for soldiers with combat-related limitations. This could become a model for other units dealing with similar challenges." The assignment represented a complete transformation from the morning's confrontation to an opportunity for Sarah to contribute meaningfully to an issue that had deeply personal significance for her. The colonel's willingness to move beyond his initial assumptions and embrace new possibilities demonstrated the kind of adaptive leadership that effective military organizations required. As their meeting concluded, Colonel Harrison made another unexpected request. "I'd like you to consider sharing your story more broadly within the unit. Your experience could help other soldiers understand the reality of combat injuries and the ongoing challenges that wounded warriors face." Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and anxiety about the prospect of becoming more visible as a wounded veteran. Her months of carefully maintained privacy had protected her from unwanted attention and assumptions, but they had also limited her ability to connect with others who might benefit from her experience and perspective. "I'm willing to consider it, sir," she replied, "but I'd want to approach it carefully. Not every wounded warrior is ready to share their story publicly, and I don't want to create pressure for others to reveal more than they're comfortable discussing." The colonel nodded with appreciation for her thoughtfulness. "That's exactly the kind of sensitivity that would make you effective in this role. We need leaders who understand both the benefits and the risks of increased visibility for wounded veterans." Their conversation had lasted over an hour, and Sarah left the colonel's office with a fundamentally different perspective on her future at Fort Braxton. The morning's confrontation, which had seemed like a potential disaster, had transformed into an opportunity for meaningful contribution and professional growth. Word of Sarah's private meeting with Colonel Harrison spread through informal channels, adding another layer to the evolving narrative of her presence at the base. Soldiers who had witnessed the morning's dramatic revelation now understood that significant changes were likely to result from the unexpected turn of events. Janet Stevens was waiting for Sarah outside the administrative building, her concern and curiosity evident in her expression. "How did it go?" she asked as they walked toward the dining facility for lunch. "Better than I could have imagined," Sarah replied, still processing the implications of her conversation with the colonel. "He wants me to develop a program for supporting wounded warriors. It could actually turn into something really meaningful." The transformation in Sarah's circumstances over the course of a single morning was remarkable by any standard. She had begun the day as an isolated soldier hiding significant trauma behind careful privacy, and she was ending it as a recognized expert with an opportunity to make systemic contributions to an important military challenge. But the changes extended beyond just Sarah's individual situation. Colonel Harrison's response to learning about her combat injuries had demonstrated to the entire unit that effective leadership required flexibility, openness to new information, and willingness to admit and correct mistakes. His handling of the situation would influence how other soldiers approached similar challenges in the future. The ripple effects of the morning's events were already visible throughout the base. Soldiers who had made casual assumptions about Sarah's limitations were reconsidering their judgments about other colleagues. The confrontation had served as a powerful reminder that surface appearances rarely told complete stories about people's experiences and capabilities. Sergeant Williams incorporated lessons from the morning's events into his afternoon training sessions, emphasizing the importance of understanding individual circumstances before making assumptions about soldiers' motivations or capabilities. His approach to managing soldiers with physical limitations would be permanently influenced by what he had witnessed during Sarah's revelation. As evening approached, Sarah found herself reflecting on the unexpected trajectory of her day. The decision to reveal her combat injuries had required enormous courage, but it had also opened possibilities that her secrecy had foreclosed. The challenge now would be managing her new visibility while maintaining the emotional equilibrium that had allowed her to function effectively despite her trauma. 3 months after the confrontation that changed everything, Sarah Martinez stood before a room filled with military officers, medical professionals, and wounded warriors from across the region. Her presentation slides displayed the comprehensive Wounded Warrior Support Program that had grown from a single colonel's challenge into a model being considered for implementation throughout the entire military branch. The irony was not lost on her. The morning that had begun with questions about her commitment to physical fitness had evolved into recognition as a subject matter expert on adaptive military service. The program she had developed addressed not just the physical challenges that wounded warriors faced, but also the psychological and social barriers that often prevented them from maximizing their continued contributions to military service. Colonel Harrison sat in the front row of the audience, his presence serving as both support for Sarah's presentation and testament to the transformation in his own understanding of effective leadership. The decorated officer who had once questioned her dedication now served as her strongest advocate, helping to promote her innovative approaches throughout the military hierarchy. The fundamental principle behind the Adaptive Service Excellence Program, Sarah explained to the assembled audience, is that combat injuries represent changes in capability rather than absolute limitations. Our goal is to identify and develop pathways that allow wounded warriors to contribute meaningfully while working within their individual constraints. Her presentation drew from extensive research, consultation with medical professionals, and interviews with dozens of wounded veterans. But the foundation of her insights came from personal experience that gave her credibility that no amount of academic study could have provided. The audience listened with rapt attention as she outlined practical solutions to problems that had frustrated military organizations for decades. Janet Stevens watched the presentation from the back of the room, marveling at the confidence and authority that her friend now displayed when discussing wounded warrior issues. The transformation from isolated soldier to recognized expert had been remarkable to witness, but Janet understood that it had come at significant personal cost. Sarah's willingness to share her story had required confronting trauma that she had spent years learning to manage privately. The program Sarah had developed included several innovative components that addressed different aspects of the wounded warrior experience. Modified physical training protocols ensured that injured soldiers could maintain fitness without risking additional harm. Peer support networks connected veterans with similar injuries to share strategies and emotional support. Career development pathways identified alternative roles that could utilize the skills and experience that wounded warriors brought to military service. One of the most important discoveries we made during program development, Sarah continued, was that many wounded warriors possess enhanced capabilities in areas that traditional military assessment doesn't recognize. Combat experience combined with personal experience managing significant challenges often creates insights and problem-solving abilities that are extremely valuable in the right contexts. The audience included several generals and senior administrators who had the authority to approve and fund expanded implementation of Sarah's program. Their attention and engagement suggested that her work was being taken seriously at the highest levels of military leadership. The morning confrontation that had seemed like a career-threatening disaster was evolving into opportunities that Sarah had never imagined possible. Dr. Rebecca Chen, the base's chief medical officer, had worked closely with Sarah throughout the program development process. Her medical expertise combined with Sarah's practical experience had created a comprehensive approach that addressed both clinical and operational considerations. Dr. Chen had been particularly impressed by Sarah's ability to translate complex rehabilitation concepts into practical military applications. Specialist Martinez's program represents a fundamental shift in how we think about service after injury, Dr. Chen had written in her formal evaluation. Rather than focusing primarily on what wounded warriors can no longer do, this approach emphasizes discovering and developing what they can do exceptionally well. The presentation continued with detailed case studies of wounded warriors who had benefited from early implementation of Sarah's program concepts. One soldier with traumatic brain injury had developed new training protocols for complex decision-making under pressure. Another with mobility limitations had designed innovative equipment modifications that improved efficiency for entire units. A veteran with PTSD had created peer counseling networks that were reducing suicide rates and improving retention among combat veterans. Colonel Harrison had been instrumental in securing resources and administrative support for Sarah's program development. His own transformation from skeptical commander to passionate advocate had become part of the program's narrative, demonstrating how leadership attitudes could either support or undermine wounded warrior integration. The colonel's willingness to admit his initial assumptions were wrong and, then, actively support new approaches has been crucial to our success, Sarah explained during the question period following her presentation. Effective wounded warrior programs require leadership that values adaptation over adherence to traditional standards. The comment drew nods of approval from several senior officers in the audience who had their own experiences with the challenges of balancing military standards with individual accommodation needs. Sarah's diplomatic handling of the sensitive topic demonstrated the political awareness that had contributed to her program's acceptance at high levels of military leadership. As the formal presentation concluded, Sarah found herself surrounded by audience members seeking additional information, offering collaboration opportunities, and sharing their own experiences with wounded warrior challenges. The networking and relationship building that occurred after her presentation would prove crucial for expanding implementation of her program concepts. Captain Maria Rodriguez, a wounded warrior from another base, approached Sarah with tears in her eyes. "Your presentation gave me hope that I haven't felt since my injury," she said. "I've been struggling with the feeling that my military career was essentially over, but your program suggests there might be meaningful ways for me to continue serving." These kinds of personal connections had become the most rewarding aspect of Sarah's work. Her willingness to share her own story had created safe spaces for other wounded warriors to discuss their challenges and explore possibilities they hadn't considered. The isolation and secrecy that had characterized her early recovery was being replaced by community and collaboration. Lieutenant Colonel David Park, representing the Program Evaluation Committee, approached Sarah with formal recognition of her work's significance. "Specialist Martinez, I want you to know that your program is being recommended for implementation across all major installations in our region. The potential impact on wounded warrior retention and effectiveness could be transformational." The recognition represented validation of both Sarah's personal journey and her professional contributions. The combat injuries that had once seemed like career-ending limitations had become the foundation for expertise that was changing military policy at the highest levels. But Sarah understood that success also brought new responsibilities and challenges. Her visibility as a wounded warrior advocate meant that she would face ongoing expectations to share her story, provide guidance to other veterans, and maintain the emotional resilience necessary for public leadership. The privacy and anonymity that had once protected her were no longer options. Sergeant Williams, who had observed Sarah's transformation since that dramatic morning 3 months earlier, reflected on the lessons the experience had taught him about leadership and assumption-making. His approach to managing soldiers with limitations had been permanently changed by witnessing Sarah's revelation and subsequent contributions. I've learned to ask better questions and make fewer assumptions, he had told other training supervisors during a recent professional development session. Sometimes what looks like weakness or avoidance is actually incredible strength being applied in ways we don't immediately recognize. The broader impact of Sarah's story extended beyond just wounded warrior programs. Her experience had sparked conversations throughout Fort Braxton about the assumptions that military personnel made about their colleagues' capabilities and motivations. The casual judgments and quick assessments that had characterized much interpersonal interaction were being replaced by more thoughtful and nuanced approaches. Dr. Chen had documented the psychological benefits that Sarah experienced as a result of her increased openness about her combat injuries. The transition from secrecy to advocacy has been remarkable to observe, she noted in her clinical assessment. Specialist Martinez has found purpose and community through sharing experiences that she once kept carefully private. As Sarah packed up her presentation materials at the end of the day, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this point. The morning confrontation with Colonel Harrison had forced her to confront truths about herself that she had been avoiding, but it had also opened pathways to contributions she had never imagined possible. Janet Stevens helped Sarah carry her materials back to their shared office space, both women still processing the significance of what they had witnessed. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't decided to tell the colonel about your injuries that morning?" Janet asked. Sarah considered the question carefully. "I probably would have continued hiding, managing my limitations privately, and missing opportunities to help other people facing similar challenges. Sometimes the things we're most afraid of revealing turn out to be our greatest sources of strength." The transformation in Sarah's circumstances had been remarkable, but it had also required ongoing emotional work to process the trauma that her revelation had brought back to the surface. Regular counseling sessions with Dr. Chen helped her maintain the psychological stability necessary for her public role while continuing to process the complex emotions associated with her combat experiences. Colonel Harrison submitted his final evaluation of Sarah's program development work with recommendations for rapid promotion and expanded responsibilities. Specialist Martinez has demonstrated exceptional leadership, innovation, and dedication to improving military effectiveness, he wrote. Her contributions represent the kind of adaptive thinking that our organization needs to address evolving challenges. The Wounded Warrior Support Program that had grown from one morning's confrontation was now being studied by military organizations internationally. Sarah had received invitations to present her work at conferences, collaborate with research institutions, and advise policy development committees. The local initiative had evolved into something with national and international significance. But perhaps the most meaningful aspect of Sarah's transformation was the community of wounded warriors who had found hope and direction through her program. The isolation and secrecy that had characterized her own early recovery was being replaced by networks of support and collaboration that were changing lives across the military system. As she walked across the Fort Braxton training grounds that evening, Sarah could see soldiers engaged in physical training exercises. Some were following standard protocols, while others were working through modified alternatives designed to accommodate various limitations. The difference was that the modified exercises were no longer viewed as special accommodations or signs of weakness, they were recognized as adaptive strategies that allowed all soldiers to contribute their maximum capability. The legacy of that confrontational morning 3 months earlier extended far beyond Sarah's individual circumstances. It had demonstrated the power of truth-telling, the importance of adaptive leadership, and the potential for transformation that existed when people were willing to move beyond their initial assumptions and embrace new possibilities. Colonel Harrison's own reflection on the experience had led to changes in his leadership philosophy that would influence hundreds of soldiers throughout the remainder of his career. The lesson that surface appearances rarely told complete stories about people's experiences and capabilities had become a central principle of his command approach. Sarah Martinez had begun that fateful morning as an isolated soldier hiding significant trauma behind careful privacy. She was ending this chapter of her life as a recognized expert whose work was changing military policy and improving lives throughout the wounded warrior community. The transformation had required courage, vulnerability, and persistence, but it had also demonstrated the extraordinary possibilities that could emerge when people were willing to share their most difficult truths in service of something larger than themselves.